morning everyone. This is Sanvi Hippargi, Assistant Professor in CSE Department, NB Navle Sinhagad College of Engineering, Solapur. In this lecture, we will be discussing constructors in derived class. In inheritance, we usually create objects of derived class. Then it becomes the responsibility of derived class constructor to pass arguments to the base class constructor. There are certain cases which we need to consider. The first case is if base class constructor do not take any argument, then derived class constructor need not to have any constructor function. If base class constructor takes one or more arguments, then it's mandatory for the derived class to have a constructor function and pass arguments to the base class constructor. If both base and derived classes contain constructors, then base class constructor is executed first and then derived class constructor is called. And it is the responsibility of the derived class constructor to take parameters for base class constructor as well. Now, we will see few cases with example. This is the example where there is a constructor in base class which does not take any argument. B is a base class which has a constructor which is a default constructor and which displays base class in it. Then D is a derived class which is inherited from the base class B, and this need not have any constructor function as it does not have to pass any argument to the base class constructor. When we will be creating an object of the derived class, constructor function in the base class is called first, then constructor from the derived class will be called. So there is a constructor in the base class which displays base class, and this will be the output. In this example, there is a constructor in the derived class but not in the base class. So B is a base class which does not have any constructor in it. In the derived class D, there is a constructor function which is a default constructor which displays derived class. When we create an object of D, compiler will search for the constructor in the base class. If there is no base class constructor, compiler will call the derived class constructor. The output will be displayed as derived class. In this example, there is constructor function in both base as well as derived class. In the class B, there is a constructor which is a default constructor which displays base class. In the derived class D, there is a default constructor again which displays derived class. When we create an object of the derived class D, compiler will call the constructor in the base class first. It's a default constructor, so it's not taking any parameters. It displays base class first. Then the derived class constructor is called. In this example, there are multiple constructors in base class and a single constructor in the derived class. Now in base class, we have default constructor which displays base class with no argument, and it also has a parameterized constructor which takes a single parameter, and this displays base class with one argument. This is the argument which must be passed by the default constructor. Now, the default constructor is also receiving one argument which will be used in it, which displays derived class which is receiving one argument. Now, this default constructor is not passing any argument to the base class. So, this constructor cannot be called. When we create an object of the derived class D, if we pass an argument here, this argument will be used in the default constructor only. The default constructor is not passing this argument to the base class constructor. So when we create the object of derived class constructor, there are two base constructors. This will be parameterized, so this will not be called, as D is not passing any parameter to the base class constructor. So compiler will call the default constructor, so it displays base class with no argument. Then default derived class constructor will be called, which receives one argument. This constructor will not be called as D is not passing any parameter to this constructor. Now, in this example, we have constructor in both base as well as derived class. Base class constructor takes an argument. Then it is the derived class constructor's responsibility to pass this argument to the base class constructor, which is not done here. When we create an object of the derived class, this argument will be used inside this derived class, which will not be passed to the base class. But when we create an object of derived class, constructor of the base class must be called first. So the output of this program will be an error, as default constructor is not passing any argument to the base class constructor.